בקמפוס ומעבר. אני אמשיך לדבר באנגלית לטובת האורחים שהגיעו מחו"ל. I want to welcome you all to the second annual roundtable of Israel Academia Monitor. This year's event is entitled BDS Against Israel, On Campus and Beyond. Our chairperson, Professor Yakir Plesner, sends his apologies for not being able to attend due to health issues. We wish a speedy recovery, and our thoughts are with the Plesner family at this time. Israel Academia Monitor was founded a decade ago to monitor radical faculty who have misused academic freedom to push their political agenda at the expense of the taxpayers. Moreover, we recently published a research, Academic Freedom in Israel, a Comparative Perspective, to demonstrate that this type of behavior would not be tolerated in public universities of our comparative cases, Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. We have 38 copies of the book for sale in a special publication. You may purchase it at the break. As part of our monitoring activity, 2.5 years ago, we noticed a significant uptick in academic boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, activities. We felt that this new phase of a larger movement is extended well beyond the usual radical model of Israel is an apartheid state, and that it had significant support in the civil society project of the European Union. We felt so alarmed by the finding that I personally contacted a number of Israeli officials and conference organizers to share our information. We also created a database to document BDS events, but unfortunately no one was interested. On the positive side, because of our large research effort, we are in a position to provide the first systematic analysis of the new developments, as will be discussed in this roundtable. We are very fortunate to have this evening some very well qualified experts to address this issue. In order to frame the phenomenon of BDS, we are going to start with Professor Ofira Seligtar, who has extensive background in analyzing predictive failures in intelligence. She is the author of 10 books and scores of articles and chapters on the subject. Professor Seligtar is the chair of Strategy and Intelligence section at the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa. She is currently working on a book, Soft Asymmetrical Conflict Against Israel, an Intelligence Approach, which places the BDS drive in the broader effort to apply pressure on Israel. Our keynote speaker will speak next, after Ofira. He is Honorable Kenneth L. Marcus, President and General Counsel of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law in Washington, D.C. Mr. Marcos was a staff director of the U.S. Commission of Civil Rights and later held the Lillian and Nathan Ackerman Chair of Equality and Justice in America at the Baruch College of the City University of New York. As head of the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, he was critical in defining Jewish students as a minority protected against discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Mr. Marcos is the leading attorney in cases of anti-Semitism and BDS on American campuses. He is also an internationally recognized authority on anti-Semitism and serves as associate editor of the Journal of Study of Anti-Semitism. Mr. Marcos is the author of a highly acclaimed book on legal aspects of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. His new book on the definition of anti-Semitism is due from Oxford University Press early next year. The next speaker will be Professor Richard Landes, a professor of medieval history at Boston University, the co-founder and director of Boston University's Center of Millennial Studies, and a fellow of the Open Society Institute at Boston University. Professor Landes is the author of the popular Eugene Stibel's blog and the new media analysis project, The Second Draft, which analyzes the Mohammed al-Dora affair and the phenomenon called Pallywood, as well as the practice among Palestinian journalists to turn stage drama into news. And the last speaker will be Ben-Dror Yemini, a highly regarded columnist, a former deputy editor of Ma'ariv, currently in Yediot Ahronot. He has written extensively on the issue of campus radicalism. Yemini studied history and law in Tel Aviv University and practiced law for a few years. He was then appointed advisor to the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption and served as spokesman for the office. He was director of the program of training for leadership at Tel Aviv University. And in the year 2012-2013, he spent a sabbatical in the United States. Yemini is the author of a new book, The Industry of Lies, which is due to be published in 2 months. Now, if you have questions during our conference, please write them down and hand them to me during the last break, which is about 8 o'clock, just in the beginning of the break. Thank you. Now we will begin. Thank you.
I brought my PowerPoint.
Hang on a minute, let me start. I need to connect it. איפה אמיר? Do you know how to connect it? Here. Ilan will come and help you. Ilan? אתה יודע איך לחבר את זה? טוב. נחבר את זה. Sorry? We're gonna connect it in a minute. Okay. Hang on a minute, but it's not connected, so we just have to get Amir to connect it.
Where is Amir?
Yeah, it'll be coming in a minute.
What's it?
אתה יכול לחבר לי את זה? You click each one, either an enter or this one.
Yeah. Enter or
איך אתה מחבר לי את זה?
Oh my God.
יוסי? I know, so maybe we start with the...
I can't start
No,
that.
maybe we start with Ken and then you will do the next. אתה יכול להביא את יוסי בינתיים? תודה.
You didn't take care?
Yeah, I did, but you can do this one. So we'll start with Kenneth Marcus first, and then we'll do the presentation by Ophira.
Okay, good. Good evening. Slightly out of order, but still fine. Pleasure to be here. Thank you to Israel Academia Monitor and Dana Barnett for putting this together, and Ophira Selectar for involving me, members of the board who've put this together, distinguished faculty members, students, friends. Good to see you all. My topic today is whether the BDS movement, that is, the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel, is anti-Semitic. And I hesitate to plunge in because there are several objections that are immediately raised when this topic comes up. The first one that I get frequently from Jewish audiences whenever I speak on anti-Semitism is, why just talk about issues relating to the Jews? Why can't we speak more broadly about anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, and lots of other topics? Why just focus on issues for the Jews? I get this a lot by people who are concerned about other disadvantaged or oppressed groups who may not have sufficient wherewithal to speak more for themselves. And I have to tell you that while I hear this very frequently when speaking to Jewish audiences, I have also, over the years, spoken frequently to other groups and not ever heard that sort of objection. For instance, when I've spoken in Indian country about problems for Native Americans, I'm never asked why just Indians, why not Puerto Ricans. I've spoken about anti-black issues to African American audiences, and I'm never asked, well, why not the gays and lesbians, right? It's only when I talk to Jewish audiences that I get that objection and a concern that we should be more universal. And so I'm going to disregard the topic for a moment and talk about something completely different, okay? Do any of you have any interest at all in the poll tax? Whatsoever? No one. Okay. So my estimation is that I have between 3 to 5 minutes before the folks at the ends leave the room, and maybe 5 to 7 for the middle. So I'll talk fast, and I'm going to say a few words about whether the poll tax disenfranchises black Americans, right? In the period leading up to 1965 when it was abolished. Probably, anyone know what the poll tax is? A couple. If you tax everybody the same amount, that's a poll tax. So when God said in Shemot to Moses, when he said, go to every Jewish man over 18 and get a half a shekel from them in order to build a temple, that was a poll tax. But Americans have a funny use of language, and when we vote, we say we're going to the polls. So in the United States, the poll tax is something you have to pay to vote. Now, this became unlawful in 1965, but until it was prohibited, many people supported it, and it was established in many states and localities, especially in the South. And I will tell you that people had lots of reasons for supporting it. So if you're thinking it's racist, before you make exaggerated claims about the poll tax, let me assure you that there were people innocent of heart who supported the poll tax. It was, after all, a facially neutral way of obtaining revenue. It was a way to get money from people without the complications and inefficiencies of an income tax in some places. So some people just wanted to get money. There were other people who had less noble reasons for supporting the poll tax. For instance, some of them were elitist, and they thought poor people were ignorant and shouldn't get to vote. So if you ask everyone to pay money before you vote, you will have a higher proportion of rich people who are voting. Now, aristocratic and elitist views do have sometimes a racial component, but sometimes not. There were certainly some people who supported the poll tax simply because they were elitist. That's not a good thing, probably, but not necessarily because they were racist. On the other hand, there were unquestionably some people who supported the poll tax because it was a way of limiting the number of black people who were voting. And the fewer black people who are voting, the easier it would be in southern states to elect segregationists. That is to say, people who wanted to keep white and black people separate in schools and other things. So suppose the year is 1964. Poll taxes are still legal. And we're having a conversation about the poll tax. And I were to say, well, I think the poll tax is racist. And maybe we would have a discussion. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. How dare you say it's racist when there are so many people who, for innocent reasons, support it? Aren't you casting aspersions where they're not due? And yet I think that anyone who looks at the issue nowadays says that's utterly absurd. We know without question that the poll tax was the paradigmatic case of an institution that was created to disenfranchise black Americans. That's what it was there for. Now, there undoubtedly were people who were sufficiently naive or ignorant to support the poll tax without realizing that they were making common cause with blatant racists. And yet it was an institution that through and through was perhaps the most single successful mechanism after slavery for delegitimizing black Americans. Now, if the year were 1964, after we passed the Civil Rights Act in America, and the question is, should a civil rights organization deal with the poll tax? Maybe you would say, no, no, no. Maybe if there are racist applications of the poll tax, maybe if the poll tax is used unequally when it comes to black Americans versus white, maybe then. Or maybe if there's some sort of harassment of black people outside the voting booth, then maybe. But not a civil rights group shouldn't deal with an institution that's... Nobody would say that. Anyone who makes that argument now or who had made it in 1964 would have been treated as an idiot, because it was very widely understood that you couldn't be serious about civil rights and anti-black discrimination in the year 1965 without fighting the poll tax. It was the center of racist institutions in the United States, and if you were serious about the poll tax, you opposed it. Okay. So I've talked about anti-black discrimination, and I think you all understand that I've spent the last few minutes talking about BDS. But before I say something more explicit about whether BDS is anti-Semitic in the way poll taxes were racist, I'm going to make a few other caveats. Because if any of you have been actively engaged in this sort of debate or actively engaged in discussions about what is anti-Semitic and what is not, you know that there are lots of problems with even discussing it that are always invariably raised when the issue comes up, right? People say, don't talk about whether something is anti-Semitic. Why? Because that coarsens debate. It leads to an exchange of aspersions. We say anti-Semitic, they say we're racist. It makes the dialogue worse. Or it gets people's hackles up, and it leads to a conversation which is less substantive. Or it distracts attention from substantively important issues like what Israel is doing on some policy or other. Okay. Or it distracts attention from the peace process and makes it harder to do that, or it exacerbates ethnic conflict. And in fact, if you charge anti-Semitism against people who are opposed to Israel in some fashion, you will be charged with exaggerating the issues, making false claims, or crying wolf. Worse, in the United States at least, if you charge anyone who is anti-Israel with being anti-Semitic, you will be punished. Punished how? Well, if you look through American case law, not just on Israel, but in general, to see, well, what is anti-Semitism? You will find that overwhelmingly legal cases that ask the question, what is anti-Semitism, do so in order to determine whether one should punish the accuser, not the accused. The question is usually whether the charge is defamatory, not whether it's accurate. And in public discourse, we see this over and over again. Just a couple of examples. A few years ago, there was an Italian periodical that had a really unpleasant, stereotypical caricature of then parliamentarian Fiamma Nierenstein, showing her as a hook-nosed monster surrounded by stars of David. Well, one journalist said that the caricaturist was doing something anti-Semitic. And what happened? Was the caricaturist exposed and punished? No, of course not. The journalist was sued for defamation and lost, convicted for it and fined. Around the same time in Washington, D.C., there was a think tank that used the term Israel Firsters to describe American Jews who were thought to be disloyal to the United States because of the way in which they supported Israel. One other think tanker named Josh Block said this is anti-Semitic to speak in this way. And what happened? Josh Block got fired for having used the term anti-Semitic in what was considered to be then a false or exaggerated way. There was Mid-Atlantic University that just a couple of semesters ago we heard from a student who had gotten into a discussion with a professor who wanted her to defend her views on Israel. Well, she choked up a little bit. She didn't know exactly what to say under the spot, but later on she sent him an email that had a fairly innocuous discussion from an Irish intellectual who said that college students shouldn't be tricked into anti-Semitic ideas by people who want them to treat the Jewish state different than any others. Well, the professor was outraged and said, don't send me any other materials like this. And she said, I'm very sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. And he said, when you charge someone with anti-Semitism, you don't get to apologize. You get to explain it to the dean, which is where we're going. So over and over again, when something is anti-Semitic, the question is not, is the accusation valid? And if so, what do we do about it? It's, how dare you even raise the topic, and what will we do to punish you? And yet I believe that despite the risks, it is necessary, even if sometimes rude, to ask the question, is BDS or other forms of anti-Israelism anti-Semitic? Why is it necessary to do that? Sometimes we can win the argument on BDS without doing that. A few months ago, the American Studies Association, as you might be aware, adopted a resolution supporting the BDS movement, the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. And in its wake, over 200 university presidents in the United States were convinced to issue statements condemning the ASA for what they did. The statements sometimes had fairly ringing terms, but almost invariably they were statements about academic freedom, not about anti-Semitism. And there are some who say, well, you know what, if you can beat BDS, at least sometimes, by talking about academic freedom, isn't that the way to go? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, and here are the problems that I see with that. To begin with, if you're at an institution whose mission is the search for truth, then it seems to me you should be asking what's true and not just what approach is politically palatable. Second, if BDS is simply a matter of fact where the advocates might be correct or incorrect, exaggerated or truthful, then it is appropriate to have debates, as the New York Times and the Los Angeles Review books have done, about BDS. Are you for or against? But if BDS is a hate movement, if it's more comparable to Holocaust denial or various forms of racism, then it's not appropriate to have that sort of debate, any more than it's appropriate to debate other stereotypical views of various minorities. There have been times where various minorities, including Jews, but lots of others, have been accused of having foul odors or ugly appearances or inferior intellects. Is it appropriate to have a debate on that? Or is it more appropriate to say, is this an example of hate or bias? And if so, we should treat it as hate or bias. Finally, it seems to me that if something is hateful, then even having a statement from a university president that it violates academic freedom has, and forgive me if this is a cultural reference too peculiar to the United States, but in the United States, we convicted the crime figure Al Capone for tax evasion, right? When in fact he was a mass murderer. It has something of the feeling of busting Al Capone for tax evasion as opposed to getting at the real crime. So what do I mean when I say a BDS movement and ask whether it's anti-Semitic? It's a difficult question because it's a difficult question even to ask what is the BDS movement. Some people will say it is a human rights movement intended to change the policies of Israel and perhaps the United States in various ways. How? Well, they will often point to what they consider to be the defining document, which is the 2005 call of the Palestinian Civil Society for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And that statement argues for BDS on three grounds. The first is that it is an effort to end the occupation by Israel of Arab lands. In some iterations, people add the words to indicate that it's Arab lands taken since 1967. At other times, they're a little bit more blunt, and it's transparent that it's not just post-1967. The second is to eliminate the unequal treatment of Arabs in Israel. And the third is to establish the right of return. Now, these are the explicit values, and often people say, well, if this is what they're aiming for, then you might agree, you might disagree, but don't call them bigots. This is the language of anti-racism. It's the language of human rights law. Well, the first problem that I have with this is that the 2005 call isn't necessarily the beginning of the BDS movement, as some claim it is. when I first read that the BDS movement started with a 2005 call, I thought, well, why do I seem to remember dozens of BDS attempts in the years 2004, 2003, 2002? And you look it up, and it's because there were dozens on college campuses around the world, especially in Europe and the United States, to boycott Israel during those years. And in fact, there were other calls to boycott Israel not before 2005, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. Each year, 2005 was simply the year in which Palestinian civil society took ownership and came up with a document that gave a nice legitimization to their arguments. At a minimum, I would argue the BDS movement goes back to Durban 1 and the hate fest which that was. And you cannot understand the BDS movement without looking at the explicit anti-Jewish as well as anti-Israel character of Durban 1. So I'd like to say we have to look at the period from 2001 to the present. But I have to say, without wanting to quibble too much, that I've seen it said that it starts in 2005 or 2001, and I don't want to get too much into history, but if you say it starts with 2001, then my question is, well, okay, so if I go back to 2000 or 1999 or 1998 or 97, there were no efforts to boycott Israel, right? But of course we know that there were continuous efforts, not only in those years, but going back to 1948, and in fact, previous to 1945, efforts first to boycott Zionists and the Palestine Mandate, and then as soon as Israel was established as a state, to boycott Israel. They were not in something called the BDS movement. It was a boycott which by 48 was called the Arab League boycott, which was in fact a state-run boycott, an official boycott, which continues to the present, although it's petered out and has been abandoned by some countries by treaty or other diplomatic agreement or for some other reasons. But we have had, since 1945, fairly consistent efforts to boycott Israel, although the rationale has changed. Now, we have an actual historian or two around, but I'm going to say one more thing about it, which is that when we say we're talking about a movement or a series of movements since 1945 to boycott Israel, I hesitate to say this, but if you were then to say to me, okay, well then that means we won't find any efforts to boycott Jews during the 1930s and 1940s, right? Well then I have to say, well, that's not entirely true. In fact, there was a boycott of Jews in 1933. Depending on how you define it, a 1 or 3 day, but certainly a temporary boycott in Germany. Then there were subsequent boycotts of Jews in Europe during that period, 33 to 45. And I'll just make a brief reference to the fact that there is now a developing literature showing that from 33 to 45, there were substantial efforts from Germany to take Nazi ideology and propaganda and translate it into Farsi and Arabic and other Middle Eastern languages to convince people in the Middle East to embrace the ideology that gave birth to the 1933 anti-Jewish boycott. And worse, what happened in 1933 is not that Adolf Hitler invented the anti-Jewish boycott, but that he did something very unusual with it. There had been Nazi hoodlums breaking into Jewish stores and convincing people not to buy from Jews in the period prior to the first week of April 1933. But they were doing it in a sort of incidental or thuggish way. Adolf Hitler's innovation was to systematize it, to rationalize it, to make it something that was run by the state, although using stormtroopers and thugs, and to give it a rationale, using the language of his time. Hitler's rationale was not that Jews are an inferior racial group and therefore we should boycott them. It was that the Jews have done bad things and must be punished. Specifically, that Jews have been engaged in aggression and are using propaganda against the German people, and that we must defend ourselves. And to defend ourselves, we must boycott the Jewish people. So whether it's 1948 or 2005, you see calls that say the Jews are doing wrong, and therefore we have to defend ourselves and come join us. I'm not going to say you have something that's identical. I'm not even going to say you have something that's historically continuous. But I will say that for those who will tell you that there's a world of difference between a human rights discourse in 2005 and what is undoubtedly a racially motivated 1933 boycott, that in fact, what we have from the documents is a rationale. It's a justification. And it simply doesn't tell you why they're doing it or what it means. So what does it mean? What does it mean when in Europe, in North America, and elsewhere, people are urging the boycott, divestment, and sanction of the Jewish state of Israel? People familiar with the 3D test of Natan Sharansky? Some, but not most. The EUMC working definition. Okay, so when people in our field ask the question, what is anti-Semitic? Sometimes we reinvent the wheel and come up with our own idea of what is anti-Semitism. And sometimes we try to use conventional definitions that have the imprimatur of either other scholars or government agencies. Natan Sharansky came up with a very interesting definition that was memorable because he used only words that begin with the letter D. He said, if you want to criticize Israel, that isn't necessarily anti-Semitic, but sometimes it is. When is it anti-Semitic? Well, if you use double standards and treat Israel differently than any other country, that might be anti-Semitic, just as Jews have been treated under different standards since time immemorial. Or if you're not just criticizing Israel, you're demonizing it. You are ascribing supernatural or demonic characteristics of this all-powerful criminal organization in the same way that people have demonized Jews over the centuries. That could be anti-Semitic. Or if you try to delegitimize, not just criticize, but delegitimize the Jewish state in the same way that others have tried to undermine the legitimacy or the normalcy of the Jewish people, that could be anti-Semitic as well. And these 3 Ds, I think in some ways it's clever because you remember it. It's not entirely conceptually crisp because it wasn't intended to be. It started as an op-ed, but it provides the core of the United States State Department's definition of anti-Semitism, which was adopted during this Obama administration in America, provides the basis of the European Union's working definition of anti-Semitism, which fleshes it out. It's questionable whether it is in use now, since it was recently taken down from the European Union's website, but it has been endorsed by many parliamentary organizations over the years. So there we have what is probably the most established notion of what is anti-Semitism when it comes to hostility towards Israel. It is likely to be anti-Semitic if it demonizes, if it uses double standards, or if it delegitimizes. Okay? And when we have BDS, double standards are what we have first and foremost, which is to say, it is rare for those groups asking to boycott or divest from Israel that they're asking to boycott or to divest from any other country. When you ask them, who else have you divested from, the answer is no one. The head of the American Studies Association was asked, well, why Israel? And his answer was, well, you have to start somewhere. Well, we know historically they have started with the Jews, but they haven't necessarily ended with the Jews. So it's double standards, and often you will see in the literature demonization as well. And the boycott movement from 33 on has been, or movements, has been nothing if not an effort to delegitimize Israel. In fact, some of the official documents of the leading organization sponsoring the boycotts will speak about what they describe as their overarching strategy, which is to eliminate the normalization of Israel. That is to say, the legitimization of Israel. Many of the early Zionists argued that the establishment of Israel was necessary to protect Jews from history of persecution because Jews had always been treated as something less than a normal people with their own land. the BDS movement is intended in part to undermine that normalcy or legitimacy. Now, I believe that this test works a little better as a presumption as opposed to a bright line rule. That is to say, there are going to be some people who use different standards for Israel than for other countries, and I don't consider them to be anti-Semitic. We can start with Jews. Let's start with my rabbi. Just because he's a rabbi doesn't mean that he isn't a self-hating Jew. It doesn't mean that he hasn't adopted some of the views inimical to Jews of the surrounding community, but take my word for it, he isn't. But he does think that our congregation, our people in the state of Israel should be held to a higher standard. Why? Because he thinks that every community should hold itself to a higher standard than to others. And so, as a Jew, he is a strong supporter of Israel, but he holds the community to higher standards. There may be Palestinians who hold double standards for Israel, and they do it out of a sense that they have been harmed in various ways, and they are engaged in a political battle. And maybe they're engaged in unfair, exaggerated, or untruthful activities. That doesn't necessarily mean they're hateful. It means they're being unfair, exaggerated, and untruthful. If someone engages in the 3 Ds, it seems to me it shifts the presumption to come up with some non-discriminatory reason why you are using the 3 Ds as opposed to answering the question once and for all. In the end, and I'll say this briefly and could unpack it later, these things are anti-Semitic in one of 4 ways. Either because the person is consciously anti-Semitic, and we know this happens sometimes. I have spoken to students at universities who have been called, forgive me, kike and dirty Jew by supporters of the BDS movement. Well, try and convince me that's not anti-Semitic. There certainly are, and I don't think there's question, some people who oppose Israel because they dislike Jews, and any study shows that. On the other hand, any study also shows that there are some people who have no hatred of Jews per se, who nevertheless support Israel. And that can be for a couple of other reasons. After intentionality, there's the question of tacit or unconscious discrimination, which is to say, we now know through an extensive psychological literature that in modern times there are people who hate blacks but won't admit it and don't think that they hate blacks, but under certain conditions, the truth will come out. And it may be that they're lying because they know that it would be looked upon badly if their racism came out, or it could be that they're lying to themselves. And there are some studies that suggest that for some it's the latter. And there are also studies suggesting that some college students, many college students, who have negative attitudes towards Israel and say that they don't have negative attitudes towards Jews, in fact, feel more negatively towards Jews than they will admit it. None of these studies show that everyone who dislikes Israel hates Jews, but it does suggest that it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit more rare. It's like supporting the poll tax without being racist. It happened, but it's sort of not the bulk of it. A third is what I would call mimesis, which is to say, whether you consciously or unconsciously dislike Jews or not, if you are engaged in the BDS movement, it is likely that sooner or later you will begin trafficking in anti-Jewish stereotypes and tropes. Sooner or later you will start disseminating language, stereotypes about Jews that involve the blood libel or that involve other sorts of anti-Jewish nastiness. It almost doesn't matter from the broader perspective whether you are consciously aware of what the blood libel is. It almost doesn't matter whether you unconsciously dislike Jews because you are engaged in speaking and disseminating anti-Semitic material. And finally, there's a complicated one, I'll say it briefly. Whether you're engaged in conscious or unconscious or mimetic anti-Semitism or not, if you are attacking the Jewish commitment to the State of Israel, you are engaged in what is called irrational ethnic traits discrimination. I'll try to unpack that just a little bit, and I know that I don't have time to go into too much detail, but I'll say this. If you say, I have nothing against Hispanics, but I don't want to hear Spanish in the workplace, it is now understood that unless there's some specific reason why Spanish is a problem in your workplace, this is an irrational way of discriminating against a trait. Perhaps. So whether it's intentional or unintentional or not, if you are attacking the Jewish commitment to the State of Israel, that is anti-Semitic. Now, there was a case in England called the Ronnie Fraser case, in which it was argued that a university teachers union that has lots of anti-Jewish lectures and debates and BDS movements is therefore creating a hostile environment for Jewish lecturers and professors. And that case went badly. Not only did the court, and it was a very low court, it was an employment tribunal, not only did it throw the case out, but it had some extremely insulting things to say, not only about Ronnie Fraser, the Jewish lecturer, but about his lawyer and anyone else supporting the cause, including elected officials and so on and so forth. It was a somewhat unbalanced opinion. And the tribunal concluded that a commitment to Israel is not a central characteristic of being Jewish. Now, I believe that in some ways they did a favor to those of us who look at this issue seriously because they crystallized the issue in what was, I think, a thundering mistake. It is true that there are Jews who individually feel no personal connection to Israel or who are hateful to Israel. If you talk about any other group and any other ethnic trait, you will find exceptions to the rule. People who don't share a trait generally associated with that group. And yet, nevertheless, over the millennia, there have been few traits more closely associated with any group than a connection to Zion has been to Jews. Whether it's in the liturgy, whether it's in the literature, whether it's in songs, whether it's in the collective memory, however expressed. So for that reason, I would argue that above and beyond the other reasons, any attack on Zionism is an attack on traits immutably connected to Jewish identity, and therefore is anti-Semitic in a sense that it's an assault on Jews. Now, I have no seconds left, but I will say one brief thing in passing. Once we conclude that BDS is anti-Semitic, either because of it involves double standards, demonization, delegitimization, and beyond that, there are so many of its exponents who are consciously anti-Semitic, others who are unconsciously or tacitly anti-Semitic. It engages in anti-Semitic mimesis and involves ethnic trait discrimination. Once we get there, the question is what to do about it. And there are lots of different things. But I will say, since I am a lawyer, that while the law in most countries, and especially the United States, does not provide ironclad protections against this, and it does provide substantial protections for the freedom of speech, there are legal avenues available under American federal law, under the Export Administration Act, tax law in the United States, or the laws of many states and municipalities, including New York. Each of these has limitations, each of these has challenges, and yet in the right case, under the right setting, under the right circumstances, there will be possibilities to challenge BDS, and I wouldn't be surprised to see those challenges coming sooner or later. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I suppose after listening to this optimistic conclusion to whether BDS can be challenged in courts and otherwise, I seem to come from a different discipline, not the legal discipline, and somehow my understanding of what is going on now is less is less optimistic for a different reason that Ken mentioned here. This particular lecture is based on a book that I am writing about soft asymmetrical conflict, which I shall try to explain by using the standard sort of Pentagon type of definitions. All of this comes from my own background in working a lot of years on intelligence. And as you can see, the SAC is a second-generation child, so to speak, of what we call low-intensity conflict. Low-intensity conflict was already an upgrade on the traditional military Clausewitz type of armies, bashing armies. So then the next step was traditional conflict, then conflict as a terror activity, and the soft components of that particular thing were supposed to legitimize the target country and improve the image of the group that sponsored that terror group. Now, it looks to me that the 21st century paradigm in warfare includes a very different type of model, and that is SAC, meaning soft asymmetrical conflict that does not include terror. What it does include is various ways of fighting a country to achieve goals apart from military and terror activities. Now, there is a lot of literature coming from the Pentagon. I just gave you one book here, and this person describes how he calls it information operation. Different people call it different names. But if you look at it, you would understand that this applies perfectly to Israel. It's not just BDS, it's not just lawfare, it's warfare. It's so many different things, and the Palestinians have employed it for more than 2 decades. Ken was absolutely correct. Boycotts have occurred before, but this is a new stage. And if you look at all the groups and all the forms and all the types of ammunition that is brought on to fight this particular conflict, you would see that this is pretty overwhelming. The NGOs, of course, are the new warriors. They're the new warriors of this particular paradigm, the 21st century. Civil society is the key word here, and they are the new warriors of the civil society. And they use force multipliers by interacting with other NGOs in 3 dimensions: the human rights groups, the environmental groups, humanitarian groups, and religious charities. So you can see already how big this field becomes. It's not just the Palestinian NGO here and there, but it's the Palestinian NGO trailing after it many others. Now, it is characterized by a prodigious use of internet outlets and advances in IT and special apps. Believe it or not, you can get an app today that would scan the product, and if the product is from the territories, you should not buy it. That's how advanced that is. This is not just BDS on a large scale, it's a BDS on a human level, one person at a time. Now, here, I owe apology to everyone here and all my colleagues who ever write about it. The SAC is extremely amorphous. It's not that we, the experts and lay people, that we look at it and don't see it because we are blind. Now, this is the very famous. This is a very famous little experiment in The 6 Blind Men and the Elephant. And this is actually used to teach conflict resolution, because each one of them went up and grabbed a different part of the elephant, and one said, well, this is a tail, and one said this is a rope, and one said this is this and this. Now, I'm not trying to say that any of us, and my colleagues especially, are blind men. What I'm trying to say that this huge sack is so big and has so many different edges and domains and different levels that is very hard to see. Each one of us grabs something and we run of it, and we think that we can save the situation by just grabbing one of them. This is not the case. Now, why is it so difficult to analyze a sack? Because a sack is a construct, it's a social construct, and it includes very many multiple networks. Here one would use a row analysis of groups. And to make things much worse, the intelligence that we need, and this is something that has been worked out by the Pentagon and other people that are interested at, they use swarm intelligence. Why swarm intelligence? Because they model the intelligence on groups of bees or locusts and whatever. The sack is not something that sits there in a concrete way. These are groups that are joining and rejoining and flying away and coming back. That's why we need very progressive tools to even figure out who is interacting with whom. So that's something that is a challenge, an ongoing challenge. Now, how does that come about? I just gave you two little sort of sketches of how it works. At the very core of this particular thing are the academic paradigms. I always said that whether it's BDS or lawfare or whatever, it is always starts with a paradigm. Without Edward Said and his determination that Israel is a colonial state, blah, 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 there would not be the possibility that that would happen. So the paradigm is always academic. Then you have the applied work which builds on the paradigm. There are so many things about Edward Said and his books and others. Now, then you have the popular work. You see, the university is sort of the center, and I'm not being proud here. I'm just saying that that's where things drip down. So they drip down to popular work and, of course, the outer layer, the conspiracy theory. And we are very lucky to have here Richard Landis, who would talk about how out of the ends of the internet, things get cleared into media. And that works all the time. And you really have a hard time figuring out what is what. Let me just give you a short example because I don't really have a lot of time. There is a professor in this university by the name of Shlomo Sand. Shlomo Sand wrote a book, famous or infamous, as somewhat we know, called The Invention of the Jewish People. Now, nothing that Sand said in this book was not published here in the outer layer. Every single sentence in his book was published in the outer layer, the conspiracy theories that have been there for years, if not more than a century. Why this book became so popular, translated into 36 languages, whereas this thing's languished in the periphery for years and years and years? The answer is very simple. Shlomo Sand is a professor at Tel Aviv University. He is supported by Israeli taxpayers. That makes him legitimate. If Shlomo Sand was a pakid, what he was a clerk. He was a clerk in the post office, right? And if he had to write the book when he was still the pakid in, Misrad Ador? Yeah. He used to be, believe it or not, he used to be a pakid in Misrad Ador. I checked it. Yeah, Lavdil. No, he was in the measures and that. No. Yeah, no. He was in the, anyway, Lavdil. If he was still a pakid and if he was still a clerk in the post office, who would have considered this book to be anything but trash? No one. Legitimacy comes from the core, from the universities. And that's where the BDS and everything started. Now, and that's why I use that elephant thing to show how difficult it is. The most we can see are the permanent groups, the cores. This is something that Gerald Steinberg uses when he looks at the NGOs, and he has about 200 NGOs that he monitors. This is the visible part. But then you have coalitions and alliances of NGOs that are coming together and going away. And I told you, if you see things like the Green Movement, right, then you would see that they are a natural ally. Why the Greens and the Palestinians? I can lecture a lot about it, but I'm not going to. Now, the worst to find out are the hidden and the concrete. Now, a lot of people are talking about the New Israel Fund, right? And this is like became the talk of the town. I have whoever writes about it and talks about it, I have bad news for them. The New Israel Fund is a peanut in a larger thing. It's just we don't know. I can give you a couple of names, and no one would have known the name, but they give much more money than the New Israel Fund, and no one have ever heard that name. Is there anyone here that heard the name Tides? Tides Foundation. Bless you. At least one. Okay. Now, how does that work? The domains of activity. They work at a paradigmatic level, and this is the most important level, the neo-Marxist critical scholarship. Said is one example of it, right? And they started it. Now you have it in the popular culture. It just drips down. Journalism, literature, traditional media, internet, psych ops, that's a different level. Now, a very important part, and I think Ken alluded to it, and there would be more of it, is legal warfare. A lot of it has to be has to be in courts. People have to fight it in courts. Then you have false propaganda, self-appointed people tribunals, special investigative committees, who knows who is what, right? And then the thing that we are especially interested in is the BDS, the academic culture, whatever. So these are all parts of that big picture. Now, as someone who spent a lifetime doing intelligence failures, I have three very short ones to tell you how the lack of attention to the SAC at the highest level of this government, and I'm not going to name names here, obviously, right? But at the highest level of this government this issue was totally not worked at. This issue was totally neglected. And as Dana said, she tried to interest people. She was brushed off because this particular SAC is so different from what we know that people just reject it as a paradigm. If you were to go to someone and say, look, I have a work on terrorism, right? You would be embraced. Terrorism is something that we recognize. But you see, the paradigms changed, and people that are invested in terrorism as a research domain, right, as a field, wouldn't accept it. We got to the point now that we have 10 experts of terrorism for one living terrorist. And yet, no one would accept that this is the new paradigm. Because if you talk to people that made their name, fortunes, etc., in fighting terrorism, they wouldn't like to go into this field which is amorphous, difficult, etc. So here are the failures. The first one that was a very costly one. It was Mavi Marmara. This was a failure of intelligence, not of execution. Now, I'm not going to name the person that I am putting the responsibility on. I don't want to do that. But you see, the idea was that NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, we don't deal with them. This is not hard terrorism. This is not hard intelligence. So it fell between the cracks, and that's what happened. Now, this one was a huge public relation disaster of all places in Poland. Very few people follow that. But the way the Palestinians work, they go into a country, they recruit other folks, Polish folks. So they recruited a number of Polish folks, and the Polish folks were sent to to rehab some cisterns, 7 cisterns. Along came the IDF and promptly destroyed the cisterns. And now there was a huge problem in Poland. Everyone was writing about it, and it was extremely bad publicity. Again, the question is, who should monitor this particular thing? Gerald Steinberg is doing a great job, but Gerald Steinberg is not a government entity. Only government resources should be brought into it. Now, and this is something that really appeals. This is really something that touches upon the academia. A huge intelligence failure. Why is it that no one has seen it coming? This is something very important. No one seen it coming. The people that started it, and that means that there is a lack of understanding of how the European Union works and how this whole issue of boycotting. Let's not forget, this is BDS. But this is not a BDS that comes from some Palestinian group that is also anti-Semitic, and I'm very glad that Ken made a distinction between some of them are anti-Semitic and some of them are not, at least blatantly anti-Semitic. This is a group that is going to go after Israel big time. And that's how it happened, and no one actually looked at it. It could have been stopped before it was issued, and now it's really too late. Now, I'm sort of done almost with my time, so I cannot talk about it, but what I want to say is this. SAC is not something that I can do it on my own, or Dana can do it, or any part. This requires a huge government-level effort. And that's what is not happening. Each person or each group does one thing, covers one topic more than other topic. And here I have to say, and I'm really sorry to say that, but there is an imbalance, a huge imbalance in our relation to the phenomenon of SAC. From my experience and looking at the stuff, about 75% of writings about SAC is about how it is anti-Semitic. And only 25% deals with what really happened. How is the European Union doing? You see, and the last thing, there is a lot of mixing of the normative and the imperial. People stand up and say, well, this is anti-Semitic, right? But what it is, it's a normative statement that needs to be more empirical analysis. And again, none of us can do it individually. So that's why it is so hard. And that's what it is. It requires a tremendous amount of integrative research, academic studies, including semiotics, intelligence, forensic accounting. Forensic accounting. Where are the forensic accountants? Everyone runs to the New Israel Fund, because that's the lamp and that's the light and that's where you see it. I told you, the New Israel Fund is a peanut. There are governments who support it. There are Christian charities that support it because they're in coalitions. These people know each other and they write together, they think together, but there is no understanding of it. So that's a problem. Short-term challenges, Horizon 2000 and Ariel University. I see a few representatives from Ariel University here. They're going to go after Ariel University big time. The Horizon 2,200 people. Again, you can call it anti-Semitic, you can call it whatever you want. They're going after Ariel big time, okay? Now, this is going to be much worse, by the way, because the Palestinians are now going to join all sorts of international groups that would actually multiply the pressure. There is something called humanitarian business law. Again, you know, you can say double standards, whatever, but that's what they're going to do. And the most important thing, and I don't know whether you noticed, they got rid finally that tiresome guy, Richard Falk, was left. But you see, this is bad news. Richard Falk was good news because he was so over the edge, right, that everyone could dismiss it. The new guy is going to be very careful. Well, he's from Indonesia. He's from Indonesia. Yeah, he's to be very careful not to give anyone the appearance that he is anti-Semitic. Richard Falk was a blessing to us, the same way that Ahmadinejad was a blessing to us. Rouhani is not. Okay. Now, the other thing that needs to be discussed very seriously are the medium-range challenges. What does it mean that the demography changes in the Western countries, and how is that going to translate into support to Israel? Now, the other thing that is very important, the demographic changes and the diaspora support. You might probably notice that a lot of this boycott, divestment, and sanction is actually pulverizing. It's segmenting the American Jewish community. The big news in my country just before I was that the presidents of the major Jewish organizations did not allow J Street to join in. So that's big news. And of course, the thing that needs to be studied the most, because that's where most of the pressure comes, is the European Union and how they work. I noted that there is only one book written on the subject by someone from Ben Gurion University, and this guy didn't even get it right. So there are huge challenges, because the way the European Union works is very hard to undermine them. And actually, they have a wonderful response to double standards. They say this: look, we operate like a Congress in any other place. Some people come and pressure us and boycott us, and lobby us, and we respond. No one came to us to ask that we should boycott Cyprus. A lot of people came to ask that we should boycott the West Bank. So that needs to be discussed. So I think on this rather not cheerful note, I would end. Thank you. I hope you can back me up on this. Absolutely. There's such no understanding.
There's a lot of
That's right, exactly.
Right. Okay, yeah, you can keep this, yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for staying, even though it's getting dark. So, the name of my talk is 21st Century Jihadi Cognitive Warfare, which we've just heard about as soft asymmetrical conflict. That's what I mean by cognitive warfare, and I'll come back to it. But lethal journalism and BDS. Lethal journalism is a term you don't know yet, so I'm going to define it. I'll define a number of the terms that I use in this talk. Cognitive war, aka SAC, is the art of maneuvering a more powerful enemy into not using his military forces. Cog war is the battlefield of choice. Cognitive warfare is the battlefield of choice for asymmetrical warriors who cannot hope to win on the battlefield. If you can't win on the battlefield, the only place you can hope to win is in this. And in fact, the main goal, the ultimate goal, there are tactical moves that you make to get a more powerful enemy to abandon territory, to abandon positions that are favorable, to put him to lose the advantages that he has in the military battlefield. But the sort of the royal flush of cognitive warfare is to get a more powerful enemy to surrender without a fight. To surrender without a fight. Okay? And I'm going to talk about that in terms of jihadi cognitive warfare. Jihadi cognitive warfare is the battle waged by jihadis in the Western public sphere in service of a larger jihadi goal, which is the, let's call it the global caliphate. In other words, there are Muslims, I'm not saying this is all Muslims by any means, although I have no idea where to draw the line between Muslims who do and don't believe this, but there are two elements of Islam that we have to understand. One is what we scholars call their millennial vision. A millennial vision is a vision of a world that has been perfected, a messianic era, and it's not necessarily about to be realized. You can have long-term millennial visions. Jews who believe that Mashiach is going to come in the year 6000 are waiting another 236 years, 26 years, 226 years. So that's not apocalyptic. That's a long-term millennial vision. The millennial vision of the jihadis, and shared by more than the jihadis, the millennial vision is global caliphate, that the whole world should be Dar al-Islam. Where there was Dar al-Harb, there will be Dar al-Islam. Apocalyptic millennialism is the belief that this millennial scenario is happening now. And that's where the jihadis come in. They believe that they live in the generation when Islam will take over the world. So I'll come back to that, but they're obviously up against a pretty difficult situation because they can't possibly win that fight on the battlefield right now. There's no way that any combination of Islamic forces attacking the West could possibly conquer the West in the way that, for example, Islamic armies after the death of Muhammad conquered a good third of the inhabited globe, possibly more. All right, so that's jihadi cognitive warfare. A lethal, so they have to do it. It has to be a cognitive war. And that's where we've missed it. That's Ophira's point, exactly Ophira's point, which is we've missed the main battlefield. Our eyes are on terror. If I were to use a metaphor with animals instead of the elephant, I'd say that we are like the dog whose master points at the moon and the dog looks at the finger. The terror is the finger, but the cognitive war is what the finger's being pointed at. The cognitive war, the terrorists are just the tough cop to the nice cop of the cognitive jihadi warriors. We'll come back to that. Lethal narrative. A lethal narrative is a story about real or imagined damage that identifies and attributes malevolent intent to the perpetrator. So in other words, if you have a case where a child is killed, the lethal narrative says he was killed on purpose. He was deliberately murdered. It's not collateral damage, it's murder. That's one form of lethal narrative. And the purpose of a lethal narrative, it's basically war propaganda, is to arouse hatred and a desire for revenge in the consumer of that narrative. If you believe that narrative, then you will feel towards the person so being accused hostility. And even if you won't act on that hostility, you'll certainly sympathize with people who do act on that hostility. So a lethal narrative is a piece of war propaganda. Lethal journalism is when journalists from third parties, like let's say Western journalists who come into the Middle East, then report the lethal narratives of one side about the other as if they're news. I'll come back to this, but lethal journalism reports lethal narratives as news. I'll do journalism. BDS is boycott, divestment, sanctions, as you all know. My definition, a drive to isolate Israel from the moral global community based heavily on lethal journalism and serving a key jihadi cognitive war aim, which would have devastating effects on the West's ability to resist jihad, namely to get the West to abandon Israel. So let's begin with jihad. The current long wave of apocalyptic millennial jihad, that is, conquer the world and subject all the kufr, the infidels, to either get them to convert or to become dhimmi, began in the Muslim year 1400. There's a tradition in Islam called the Mujaddid, which is a tradition that every 100 years a renewer will come. From a point of view of millennial studies, he's really a messianic figure, and it's only retrospectively when he turns out not to be the messianic figure that he's viewed as a renewer. In the year 1300, does anybody know what happened in the year 1300 of the Muslim calendar? I'll give you a hint. It's 1882. The Mahdi of Khartoum. Every 100 years in Islamic history, you have figures like this. In my period, I'm an 11th century historian. In my period, it was the Caliph of Cairo, a Fatimid Ismaili, by the name of Al-Hakim, who is in fact at the origin of the Druze splinter group, who destroyed the Holy Sepulchre in the year 400. All right, so now we're in 1400. That's the year that Khomeini took over in Iran. That's the year that Mahmoud Abdullah al-Qahtani attacked the Kaaba stone in Mecca. That's the year that a Mahdi figure appeared in northern Nigeria, who was called the Maitatsine. And the Maitatsine means the person who curses. And he started a series of wars between his group and other Muslims and the Christians in the south that ended up killing thousands of people, and is in some senses at the origins of Boko Haram. All of that in 1979, 1400, and the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism, which is one of the most important events in the cognitive war, the SAC, against the West. It cannot be underestimated, the power of this book to paralyze the West in its ability to deal with the attack that we're under. However, with all that said, still in 2000, it's a pretty difficult thing for a jihadi to imagine how Islam will take over the world. And if you put yourself in the mind of a jihadi in 2000, imagining how could Islam possibly take over the world, you really have to be almost, how could I say, a believer. Because anybody on the outside hearing about this, how many people heard in the 1990s that Islam wanted to take over the world? Anybody here? Nobody here heard about this? No? Martin. Where's Martin? I'm thinking, Martin, did you know about this in the 1990s? No. Okay. So I knew about it only because I had a friend David Cook, who told me about apocalyptic trends in Islam, and my former classmate Dan Pipes spoke to me about it. And I remember when I first heard it, I thought it was absurd, totally absurd, that anybody could seriously think that Islam would take over the world. The only reason that I gave it any credibility is because I'm a student of these kinds of crazy movements. I have a book on millennialism. Because I'm a student of these crazy movements, I know that even if they're wrong, they're always wrong, even if they're wrong, they can do untold damage. Before the Nazis failed in their attempt to establish a 1000-jährige Reich, they did a lot of damage. So they might have been wrong, but wrong in apocalyptic millennial issues is not inconsequential. So let's go to the prayer of... So if you look at the situation for jihad the day before Y2K 2000, like December 31st, 1999, unless Y2K just shattered the West, as some people had predicted, how on earth could they have won? All of their values were the opposite of what progressives in the West held. I won't go through this, you can look at it, but basically the situation for a jihadi who wanted to take over the West, who wanted to get the West to voluntarily submit to Islam, was unthinkable, or to voluntarily put themselves in a situation where the enormous disadvantage on the military battlefield of Islam was canceled out. Why would the West cancel out the military advantage that they had over Islam? Okay. So at that point, the West is in a position of overwhelming superiority. Jihad is anathema to the West. There would surely be no voluntary conversion, and certainly no forced conversion. So this is, I made up the dream of a jihadi warrior, a mujahideen, on the cusp of the year 2000, asking Allah for the right kind of enemy. Oh Allah, give us enemies who will help us disguise our ambitions, even our acts of war, blinding themselves to our deployment, targeting them. Oh Allah, accept those of us who fight with dawah, in other words, SAC, or cognitive warfare, as moderates who have nothing to do with the violent extremists. Oh Allah, have our enemies choose these false moderates as advisors and consultants in their intelligence and police services. Oh Allah, give me enemies who will attack anyone, including Muslims, who criticize Islam. Oh Allah, give me enemies who will attack anybody who says we want to conquer the world as a bunch of conspiracy nuts and warmongers. Oh Allah, give us enemies who believe that except for a tiny minority, the vast majority of Muslims are moderate and peaceful, and that Islam is a religion of peace. Oh Allah, give me enemies who will adopt our apocalyptic enemy as theirs, so that they mistake an important ally as the cause of the conflict. And that specifically is Israel, to which I'll come back. Oh Allah, give me an enemy who legitimates our terrorism as resistance and denounces any recourse to violence in their own defense as terrorism. Oh Allah, give me an enemy who respects the dignity of our beliefs even as we heap disdain on theirs. Oh Allah, give me an enemy who introduces our intimidating street in the heart of their capital cities. And may all those who so act play prominent and trusted roles in the public sphere. Okay? So, pretty difficult thing to have happen. And yet, from September 30th, 2000 onward, this mujahideen's prayer has been richly answered, and one of the most potent fruits has been the jihadi-led movement known as BDS. The following presentation of BDS's genealogy and lethal journalism will illustrate these dynamics at work from Al-Dura to Jenin's aftermath in the San Francisco Bay Area. The nuclear bomb of jihadi cognitive warfare was the narrative of the cold-blooded murder of a 12-year-old Palestinian boy by Israeli soldiers. As lethal narratives go, it's in a special category, not a lethal framing of an actual incident, but rather the staging of one. And yet, despite ample evidence, here's Al-Dura in the 6th scene that was cut. lifting up his elbow and looking at the camera. And yet, despite ample evidence, rather than question the narrative, the Western press opened the door to the most lethal and critical aspects of that narrative. The Israelis did it in cold blood, on purpose. I'm pushing the wrong button. On purpose, mercilessly. This is the Hartford Courant in the United States. It was much worse in Europe. And like the worst, most potent blood libels, it ignited a global delirium that firmly set in place a substitution theology. Israelis were the new Nazis, Palestinians the new Jews, an allegedly impartial the Palestinians the new Jews, an allegedly impartial news analyst echoed the widespread sentiment in claiming this death, sick, it wasn't a death, erases the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. At best, if it's a death, it was collateral damage in a gunfight that Anderlein admitted was started by a Palestinian gunman. And yet it turns into something that can literally erase and replace the deliberate murder of 1 million children, 6 million people. That really is an extraordinary level of moral disorientation. The irony here was that, and I don't have this, I'm sorry, but the irony here is that even though the French were doing this, showing this on TV repeatedly because it was a kind of get out of Holocaust guilt-free card, they were in fact waving the flag of jihad in front of their Muslim populations. And what I'd be showing you if I had it with me, never mind why, is a clip from a recruiting video by bin Laden in which he uses the footage of al-Dura over and over and over again to get people to join the global jihad. And I've spoken with somebody, a Muslim who was radicalized in the aughts, in the 2005, 2007, and he was radicalized, and he said they used this footage of al-Dura repeatedly in their recruiting. All right, so, and what that happens is that led to a Muslim street. This is the demonstration in October 2000 about Muhammad al-Dura. This is 5 years later, another demonstration. This is about the cartoons. Read some of those signs. They are perfectly open. There was another sign there, Islam will dominate the world. They're perfectly open about what they want. And then this is 2009 in response to Oferet Yitzhak, we are Hamas. Okay, I'm going to skip over the example that I was going to give. There are two forms of lethal journalism. One is to report a lethal narrative by the Palestinians as if it's true. The other is to not report stuff about this is incidentally, the Palestinians actually stuck that footage of an Israeli soldier shooting a rubber bullets at a riot that was caused by al-Dura in Natzeret and inserting it into the film. So you see the boy cowering, you see this, and then you see the boy lying dead, clearly indicating that it was done in cold blood. Ramallah lynching, I'm going to skip over that. Why is this not going further? All right, take with it going further. Durban. For those who write the history of the aughts, all right, so this is an example of hate speech, genocidal incitement, and this is how it's quoted by the New York Times. The entire genocidal portion left out of the report. Durban. For those who write the history of the aughts, that's the 00s, the first decade of this century, it's worth noting the role that al-Dura played in the tone of the proceedings at Durban. Al-Dura nailed down the accusation of deliberate murder, multiplied by hundreds of lethal narratives about dead Palestinians, especially children, and shaped the icon of Israel, the genocidal colonialist, and Zionists as the new Nazis. It gave full force to a powerful redemptive paradigm that saw Israel as the final remnant of Western evil, whose eradication would lead to world peace and justice, a paradigm that took over the Durban Conference, allegedly against hatred and racism. And indeed, one could say Muhammad al-Dura was the patron saint. You see him down here being carried in effigy. There's this picture. Interesting, Israel's images of hate. It's actually Palestinians' images of hate. And down here, they're carrying the boy, Al-Dura, in effigy. His father was brought on Arafat's private jet, and he repeated over and over again his account of how the Israelis killed him in cold blood. Here, while angry crowds loudly and colorfully denounced Israel and the U.S., the two antichrists, they came up with the following plan. What Ken said is absolutely right, and here you have it. This is resolution paragraph, I think, 424 of the resolutions, that all nations should adopt a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel, the imposition of mandatory and comprehensive sanctions and embargoes, the full cessation of all links, diplomatic, economic, social, blah, blah, blah. So in other words, BDS starts here, and the ground plan for BDS is laid out here. And the first time we see it put in action is in Jenin, when for 3 weeks, reporters couldn't get in while the Israelis were attacking this one neighborhood within the Jenin refugee camp. The media worldwide reported it as a massacre based on what the Palestinian sources said. When it turned out not to be true, the media fell silent, illustrating Rafi Israeli's point in his book on poison, which is that Israel is always caught between slander and silence. When it's slander, the press talks about it. When it turns out to be false, it's silent, and they move on to the next one. This report of slaughter at Jenin produced a major global scandal. Violent and vituperous demonstrations against Israel broke out all over the Muslim and Western world. In particular, university campuses saw angry gatherings in which circulated. All right, this is a clash at San Francisco State University, and this is what was being handed out at the time. Actual blood libels, the characteristic. So this is, you can see Palestinian children meet, okay? As Hatem Bazian, the poster boy of post-Orientalist, I'm almost done, post-Orientalist academics proudly claimed, we are Hamas. They saw themselves as cognitive warriors, and they were attacking at a California University campus, and they were quite successful in many other ways. And if this was happening on some American campuses, it was flooding a Europe as drawn to anti-Americanism as much as it was to anti-Zionism, where the intelligentsia publicly adopted this Palestinian lethal narrative and much of its hate-filled language about Israel. Indeed, European progressives, including fashion models, publicly demonstrated their solidarity with Hamas during the Jenin affair, wearing suicide vests and so on. And in fact, if you look at the history of BDS, this is when it gets formally launched. So there's a direct relationship between lethal journalism on the one hand and the launching of BDS, which is dependent on it. When the journalists finally did arrive in Jenin and none of the evidence corroborated the massacre narrative, newspapers continued to headline NGO and UN officials talking about the devastation and the horror. It wasn't until late June that the UN report came out indicating only 56 Palestinians dead, 2/3 of them combatants, which turns out to be probably and far and away the most extraordinary record for low civilian militant to combatant ratios in urban warfare in the history of urban warfare. Jenin offers a host of key lessons. I'll make it very short. First of all, you can document the misbehavior of the news media, the lethal journalism, and the unwillingness to question it. And when, at one point, Andrea Koppel, who was saying, you know, there have been slaughters of Palestinians, and she was asked how she knows it, and she says, the Palestinians told us, and her interlocutor said, well, how do you know? And she said, how do you know they're not lying? And she said, oh, I suppose they're all lying now. Now, the fact that a major journalist for CNN and the daughter of a major journalist could make a remark like that shows the degree of stupidity that dominated the discourse in journalism. The resonance of the press's coverage of this behavior of both jihadi groups and Western radical groups, as we saw at San Francisco State University, the inversion of empirical reality that results from these campaigns. In other words, here's probably the most extraordinary military operation for sparing civilian lives in the history of urban warfare being presented as the worst massacre of the century, which was what the people at SFSU were saying. Western elites' persistent preference for lethal narratives about Israel, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, why are they so attracted to these stories about us? They don't want to hear stories about Muslims behaving badly. They want to hear stories about Jews behaving badly. Where does this come from? I would say anti-Semitism is a good place to look. I won't go into it now. And finally, I think it shows us how BDS draws critical strength from lethal journalism, both in the excitement of a fleeting frenzy, whether it's Lebanon or Operation Cast Lead or the Mavi Marmara, or in terms of a long-term indictment of just constant press reports coming out validating Palestinian lethal narratives. And in there, I think you have the matrix of how we're losing the cognitive war, partly because we don't understand that what actually happened in the course of the first years of the 21st century was a massive jihadi cog war allied with the radical left that attacked Israel, and nobody was prepared for it, and nobody knew how to fight back. And we're just now beginning to realize that we have to fight this cognitive war. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm going to speak in Hebrew because the majority here, I guess, it's Hebrew speakers. So since I'm in Israel, I prefer to speak in Hebrew. So those of you who don't have yet the headphones for the translation, they can do it now. אוקיי, שמענו כאן הרבה דברים מאוד מעניינים על החרם, אבל תרשו לי לומר לכם, חרם זה דבר מוצדק. כאשר יש הצדקות, חרם זה דבר מוצדק. הרי תמיד משווים את ישראל לדרום אפריקה. החרם על דרום אפריקה היה מוצדק. היה אפרטהייד. כאשר באוסטריה שיתפו את היידר בשלטון, אירופה הטילה סוג מסוים של חרם על אוסטריה. זה קרה לא כל כך מזמן. נגד איראן יש סוג של חרם. אנחנו שמחים, מאושרים, מרוצים מהחרם הזה. אנחנו מאוד חוששים שהעולם החופשי הולך לבטל את הסנקציות, את החרמות. כך שחרם בעיקרון זה לא הדבר שאנחנו צריכים להיאבק נגדו. משום שיש גם חרם מוצדק. מה שקורה היום בסיפור של ה-BDS הוא משהו קצת שונה. כי בלי שנשים לב, והדברים הוזכרו כאן, יש שינוי בשפה. אנחנו נמצאים בעידן חדש עם שפה חדשה, והשפה המרכזית היא שפת שיח הזכויות. ובשפת שיח הזכויות יש שני צדדים. יש את הצד הכובש והצד הנכבש. הצד המדכא והצד המדוכא. וכאשר אלה הדברים, וכאשר כך הם מוצגים, אז האהדה של קהלים, סטודנטים, בקמפוסים בארצות הברית, היא באופן אוטומטי, הם לא צריכים להיות אנטישמים. הם לא צריכים להיות אנטישמים. הם פשוט נשבים באותה שפה שהם בכל מקרה מוכנים לה. הרי המושג תיקון עולם הפך להיות מושג שנכנס כבר לשפה האמריקאית, בוודאי בקרב היהודים. תיקון עולם. אנחנו רוצים עולם הרבה יותר טוב. עולם משופר. עולם שבו אין כיבוש. עולם שבו אין עוני. מטרות חשובות נאצלות. ושיח הזכויות ושיח ה-BDS נכנסים לתוך המקום הזה. והם עושים את זה בהצלחה מדהימה. צריך להודות, צריך להצדיע להם. הם עושים את זה בכישרון אדיר. כי הם לא מדברים על ג'יהאד. הם מדברים אנגלית מצוינת. הם אנשים ששייכים לה כביכול, לזרם הליברלי, ההומני, שדואג לזכויות אדם. וזה נתפס. וזה נמשך. וההתמודדות היא לא פשוטה. כי אם זה הסיפור, אז א' הם צודקים. כך שיכול להיות שצריך להקדיש כמה דברים, וזה מה שאני מתכוון לעשות בזמן שיש לי. בעצם, רגע. בעצם כל מה שהם מספרים זה בעצם שקר. ואני מדבר על שקרים. כי אם הטענות שלהם נכונות, בואו ניקח את הטענות המרכזיות. הטענות המרכזיות הן על החטא הקדמון של האתני קלינזינג, הטיהור האתני. החטא הנמשך של ביצוע פשעים ללא הפסקה. החטא הנמשך של הפרת זכויות אדם. רבים מהם נוקטים במילה ג'נוסייד, שוב ושוב ושוב, כשטיפת מוח. ג'נוסייד, ג'נוסייד, ג'נוסייד. כאשר כל זה עטוף בעניין של זכויות אדם, של תיקון עולם, אז אנחנו מקבלים תופעות כמו אופן הלל, שמי שעוקב קצת אחרי השיח שם זה אותם מועדוני הלל שאמורים להיות יהודים פרו-ישראלים, שבעצם מבקשים לשמוע את הצד השני. זה לא שהם שמעו את הצד הישראלי, הם בדרך כלל לא שומעים אותו כל כך, אבל הם רוצים לשמוע את הצד השני. את Breaking the Silence, את בצלם, את אחרים. והם נמשכים. רק לפני 3 שנים, הסטודנטים שייצגו בנשיאות של ברקלי, אוניברסיטת ברקלי, את ה-BDS היו סטודנטים שהגיעו מהלל, לאחר הדיאלוג שהם קיימו עם JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, ואחרים. והדיאלוג הזה משך אותם כי הם שמעו זכויות אדם, והם נמשכו. אני חייב לומר שאני מצדיע לאותם סטודנטים שלא נשבים, אני באמת חייב להצדיע להם, ואני פוגש אותם, ואני מסתובב בקמפוסים, ואני מדבר שם. אני חייב להצדיע להם כי צריך המון כוח, כדי לא להימשך לדבר הזה. וגם בדיון, רק בהערת אגב, בשאלה, כן אנטישמיות או לא אנטישמיות, בואו לא נשכח שחלק ניכר מהפעילים המרכזיים הם יהודים. הם יהודים. אבל עיקר העיקרים, שאותו אנחנו הרבה פעמים שוכחים, מדובר בסדרה איומה, נוראה, מדהימה, של שקרים. בואו נתחיל. עוד לפני שהתחיל ה-BDS, יש אדם שנדמה לי ייסד את ה-BDS לפחות אידיאולוגית. קוראים לו אילן פאפה. אני כאדם שהיה פעיל במשך הרבה מאוד שנים במחנה השלום, זוכר שבשנת 2002 קראתי מאמר שלו. והנה הדברים. אני בוודאי לא צריך לתרגם. והוא כותב שטרנספר הוא המדיניות הרשמית של המרכז הבינתחומי, והוא כותב ששרי מפלגת העבודה הציעו לממשלה טרנספר, והוא כותב שפרופסורים ואנשי מדיה ממליצים תומכים בטרנספר, ורק מעטים מעזים להתנגד. עשיתי דבר פשוט, הרמתי אליו טלפון. מכיוון שאמרתי, רגע, אני קורא כזה דבר, ואני בטוח שיש פה טעות. לא יכול להיות שמרצה באוניברסיטה הישראלית, באותם ימים, אגב, הוא היה באוניברסיטת חיפה, בינתיים הוא עזב לאסקס. אבל לא יכול להיות שמרצה ישראלי יכתוב כזה דבר. אני התקשרתי אליו ואמרתי לו, ערב טוב, דוקטור פאפה, קראתי מאמר שאתה חתום עליו, ואמרתי זה בשיא הרצינות, אני חושב שיש כאן טעות. לא יכול להיות. פשוט לא יכול להיות. והוא אומר לי, למה לא יכול להיות? אמרתי לו, תשמע, אני עורך עמודי הדעות בעיתון מעריב, וא' לא הגיע אליי אף פעם אף מאמר של פרופסור או של עיתונאי שתומך בטרנספר, מכיוון שאני קורא גם עיתונים אחרים, לא קראתי מאמר אחד בעיתונות המיינסטרימית בישראל של מישהו שתומך בטרנספר, ואני רוצה לומר לך שאם היה מגיע אליי מאמר כזה, לא הייתי מפרסם אותו. אז איך זה יכול להיות שפרסמת דבר כזה? התשובה הייתה מביכה. משהו שהיה מאוד קשה להבין אותו. וזה נמשך ונמשך ונמשך. אחר כך הוא פרסם את הספר שלו הידוע על ה-Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, שהפך להיות התנ"ך של חלק גדול מתומכי האפרטהייד וויק, ה-BDS, וכל הקמפיין האנטי-ישראלי. וזה נמשך. שקרים. כדי להפוך, כדי שסטודנטים צעירים יתמכו ב-BDS, הם צריכים להבין שישראל היא מפלצת, כי אחרת הם לא יתמכו ב-BDS. אז למשל, הנה סיפור שמוכר להרבה מאוד ישראלים. נוהל חמור. בנוהל חמור, למי שלא יודע, חיילים ישראלים לוקחים פלסטיני, קושרים אותו לחמור, משלחים את החמור, וכך בעצם שולחים את אותו פלסטיני למוות בייסורים איומים ונוראים. הסיפור הזה פורסם בעיתון הארץ, הגיע גל של תגובות, כולל ניצולי שואה, שכתבו לעיתון הארץ, אנחנו מזועזעים, לאן הידרדרנו? איך כזה דבר קורה לנו? איך גידלנו חיילים כאלה? אנחנו פשוט לא מאמינים שזה קורה לנו. הייתה רק בעיה אחת בסיפור הזה. לא היה ולא נברא. לא היה ולא נברא. לא היה עיתון מרכזי אחד בעולם שלא פרסם, שלא עשה איזשהו פולו לסיפור היום והנורא הזה. ומצעד השקרים נמשך. כל האנשים שאני מציין פה הם רק אלה שתומכים ב-BDS, במעגלים המאוד קרובים האחרים. אלה מעגלי התמיכה של ה-BDS. ג'וזף מסד יושב ב-Ivy League University, והוא מפרסם מאמר שתל אביב היא העיר היחידה במערב שאין בה ערבים או מוסלמים. טוב, אנחנו יושבים עכשיו בתל אביב, ואנחנו יודעים כמה ערבים רבים גרים ברמת אביב, בתל אביב, במרכז תל אביב, וכמה אלפים עוד יותר רבים גרים בתל אביב המורחבת שכוללת את יפו. אבל הוא כתב, והוא פרופסור ב-Ivy League. הוא גם כתב שבנאום שבנימין נתניהו נשא באו"ם, הוא אמר שהוא קורא לגירוש 1.6 מיליון ערבים. הלכתי לנאום שעליו הוא כתב, ולנתניהו היה שם משפט אחד על ערביי ישראל. המדינה היהודית תמיד תשמור על על הזכויות של הערבים. זה הכל. איך הוא הגיע מזה לכך שנתניהו אמר שצריך לגרש את הערבים? אין לי מושג. אבל הוא הגיע. הסיפור המרכזי זה בעצם החטא הקדמון של ישראל. עכשיו, בימים אלה, אתם יודעים, להזכירכם, מחר זה ה-15 במאי, יום הנכבה הבינלאומי. אנחנו נמצאים עכשיו בערב יום הנכבה. בהרבה מאוד קמפוסים יש, בארצות הברית יש דבר חדש. מחלקים eviction orders, צווי פינוי, במעונות הסטודנטים. תרגיל, איזה יופי. כדי להסביר להם איזה מצג גדול, המוני, מה זה נכבה. הגירוש הגדול היום והנורא, הפשע הגדול שישראל ביצעה נגד הפלסטינים. ג'ון מירשיימר, אני מתאר לעצמי שהוא מוכר לחלק מהיושבים כאן, סיפר על אותו פשע היום ונורא שישראל ביצעה, שזה אחד הפשעים הגדולים ביותר בהיסטוריה המודרנית. וואו, פשע הגדול ביותר בהיסטוריה, אחד הפשעים הגדולים ביותר בהיסטוריה המודרנית. אותו מירשיימר, שימו לב, פרסם מאמר, לא רק אחד, אני נותן רק דוגמה אחת, שבו הוא אומר שהפתרון היחידי לקונפליקטים הוא טרנספר של אוכלוסיות. הוא כתב את זה ב-93, באמצע מלחמת יוגוסלביה, הוא חזר על זה הרבה מאוד פעמים אגב. זאת הגישה האקדמית שלו. אבל כאשר מגיעים לישראל זה כמובן פשע, איום ונורא. אבל בואו נראה משהו שקשור לעניין הזה, ואני אדלג כי אין לי הרבה זמן. רבותיי, נכבה, כלומר טרנספר, הייתה הנורמה. גם בשנות ה-40, גם לפני כן. זו הייתה הנורמה. נורמה מאוד מגונה, נורמה מאוד לא יפה, אבל זו הייתה הנורמה. צ'רצ'יל למשל, בנאום בפרלמנט הבריטי בשנת 44, אמר, גירוש יהיה השיטה המספקת ביותר, טרנספר וכו'. המון התבטאויות של חתני פרס נובל ושל אחרים. למה? טרנספר זאת השיטה הטובה ביותר לפתרון בעיות. לא מקובל היום. אני לא רוצה שחס חלילה מישהו יבין אותי לא נכון. אני רק אומר, רבותיי, נורמות משתנות. באותן שנים זו הייתה הנורמה. ומה שעשתה ישראל והיא עשתה, הייתה בריחה, אבל היה גם גירוש. וזה שההיסטוריונים החדשים באו וגילו לנו, זה נכון. היה גם גירוש, אבל זו הייתה הנורמה באותן שנים. היה גירוש, אני לא הולך לעבור פה על כל מקרי הגירושים, רק להגיד לכם שמה לעשות, היה גם גירוש של יהודי ארצות ערב, הייתה גם נכבה יהודית. ואם נדייק, אז הייתה בעצם נכבה גלובלית. הייתה נכבה גלובלית כי 52 מיליון איש עברו את החוויה של עקירה לצורך יצירת מדינות לאום. 52 מיליון איש. אז מה אתם באים בטענות לישראל, ריבונו של עולם? זה קרה בכל סכסוך באותן שנים. בין פולין לאוקראינה, 1.4 מיליון איש. מי שמע על הטרנספר, על הנכבה של הפולנים והאוקראינים? מי שמע? אף אחד לא שמע. מי שמע על פקולטות שלמות שעוסקות רק בנכבה האוקראינית או בנכבה הפולנית? בוודאי לא בנכבה הגרמנית. בין 12 ל-16 מיליון איש גורשו ממדינות מרכז אירופה. חלק גדול מהם, אולי רובם, על לא עוול בכפם. הם שילמו את המחיר על הנהגה מסוימת. יש לי עוד הרבה, אבל אני צריך לסיים. אז אני אלך רק לעניין אחד, כי אין לנו זמן. השקר הגדול. דיברנו פה הרבה מאוד על אנטישמיות. מהו השקר הגדול? זה ביג ליי. זה מושג לכל מי שמכיר קצת את לימודי השואה. זה ביג ליי. זה ביג ליי אומר, והיטלר אמר אותו, היהודי הוא סכנה לאנושות. זה השקר הגדול. עכשיו ראו איך זה חוזר היום בשפת שיח הזכויות, וזה פשוט מרתק. למשל, ארון גנדי, הוא הנכד של המהטמה גנדי. יצרנו תרבות של אלימות. ישראל והיהודים הם השחקנים הגדולים ביותר. והתרבות הזאת הולכת to destroy humanity, להרוס את האנושות. שימו לב איך השקר הגדול של היטלר חוזר לשפת שיח הזכויות על ידי אדם שעומד בראש מכון לאי אלימות. זה מדהים וזה מפחיד. אפשר להמשיך עוד ועוד. זה לא רק הוא, זה רבים ורבים ורבים באקדמיה ובתקשורת שחוזרים על השקרים האלה שוב ושוב ושוב ושוב. אגב, למה זה שקר? כי יאמרו גם רבים וטובים אגב, קלינטון בנאום שהוא נשא בקהיר אמר צריך לפתור את הבעיה הישראלית פלסטינית כי זה המקור המרכזי לטרור בעולם. תרשו לי לומר לכם, א', ל-99.99% מהטרור בעולם אין שום קשר לישראל. אלה שהורגים אחד את השני בסוריה ובניגריה ובסומליה ובתימן ובאפגניסטן ובפקיסטן ובדגסטן, אין להם מושג איפה ישראל על המפה. אבל זו הפכה לאופנה, אתה לא צריך להיות אנטישמי כדי לומר שהסכסוך הישראלי-פלסטיני הוא הגורם לאלימות בעולם. בשנת 2013, רק לסבר את האוזן, נהרגו 35 פלסטינים בסכסוך הישראלי-פלסטיני. זה בערך הממוצע של מה שקורה ב10 דקות במסגרת הגלובל ג'יהאד. אבל ישראל היא המקור המרכזי לאלימות בעולם. אתם מבינים לאן הגענו? השקר מנצח. אם יורשה לי עוד דקה אחת רק לומר משהו שאני חייב לומר. אגב, התרומה של ישראל לאלימות בעולם, אני לא הולך להציג עכשיו את כל הסטטיסטיקות כי אין זמן, אבל היא משהו כמו 0.0006%. זאת אומרת, סטטיסטית התרומה של ישראל לאלימות, כל המלחמות, כולל מלחמת העצמאות והכל, ביחד. זה 0 מבחינה סטטיסטית. אבל עדיין ישראל נתפסת כמקור המרכזי לאלימות בעולם. אני רוצה לסיים רק בדבר אחד, ואין לנו זמן, אני מקצר מאוד מאוד מאוד. הרבה פעמים זה בא מישראלים. ראו מה האיש הזה אמר, מוכר לרבים כאן. הוא אמר הוא כתב שתאי גזים הם לא הדרך היחידה לבצע השמדה. אפשר להגדיל את תמותת התינוקות. את זה הוא כתב ב-London Review of Books. כתב עת, כל מי שיודע משהו, אנשי אקדמיה, מאוד 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 יוקרתי. משפיע מאוד על העולם האקדמי והאינטלקטואלי. רק הייתה בעיה אחת עם הסיפור, עם עלילת הדם של איציק לאור המשורר. משום שיש את הנתונים של הבנק העולמי, מ-67 ועד היום הייתה ירידה דרמטית, לא לפי הנתונים שלי, לא לפי נתוני התעמולה הציונית. ירידה דרמטית בתמותת התינוקות, בזכות הרפואה הישראלית. מדברים על חרם אקדמי. 2 משפטים ממש לסיום. בגלל ההגבלות על האקדמיה ביהודה, שומרון, עזה, בשטחים. כשישראל הגיעה לשם היו 0 אוניברסיטאות. 0. רשמו טוב, 0. נכון להיום ההשכלה בקרב ערביי השטחים התפתחה והתפתחה והתפתחה והתפתחה, שהיום הם מצויים, לא לפי נתונים שלי, לפי נתונים שלהם. מקום ראשון בשיעור בוגרי האוניברסיטאות בעולם הערבי. אבל ישראל מדכאת את ההשכלה הגבוהה. וחלק מאותם חרמות של ה-AAA ו-AAS, הגופים האלה שהטילו את החרמות בשנה האחרונה, הם בגלל שישראל מדכאת את ההשכלה. הרי זה כל כך מגוחך. אפשר להמשיך ולהמשיך. סיפור זכויות האדם, סיפור גולדסטון. סיפור גולדסטון בשתי מילים. גולדסטון, לאחר פרסום הדוח 600 עמודים, נשאל שוב ושוב ושוב. תראה, גם במקומות אחרים, ואני מדלג כדי להגיע לזה, וזה ממש הסוף. תראה, שאלו אותו, גם יונית לוי, שמוכרת לישראלים שבכם, גם על ידי ביל מוירס, שמוכר לאמריקאים, מה-PBS, את אותה שאלה הוא נשאל. תראה, אבל זה קורה, אזרחים נהרגים גם במקומות אחרים, אז למה אתה בא בטענות לישראל? הרי אם נסכם את 600 העמודים, אז הסיפור הוא שישראל intentionally, deliberately, בכוונה, הרגה חפים מפשע. זה הסיפור של 600 עמודים. ואז התשובה שלו, אין לנו זמן לראות את זה למרות שיש לי את זה כאן, התשובה שלו ליונית לוי הייתה, עזבי אותי, אני לא חקרתי את הצבא האמריקאי. fair enough, אתם יודעים מה? באמת fair enough. כמה ימים לאחר מכן, כאשר הוא התראיין לביל מוירס, הייתה לו תשובה חדשה מאוד מעניינת ומאוד מרתקת. הצבא האמריקאי הלך לקיצוניות כדי להגן על חיי אדם. זאת אומרת, בין לבין הוא כנראה עשה תחקיר שאף אחד לא שמע עליו. הייתה עוד ועדה, סודית לחלוטין, ופתאום יש לו תשובה חדשה מאוד מעניינת. האיש הוא גם חנפן לקהל האמריקאי, בנוסף לכל הצרות שלו. אני עשיתי בדיקה, אגב, הייתי איתו בקשר, התכתבנו. עשיתי בדיקה, שאני לא אכנס עכשיו לפרטי פרטיה, כי אין לנו זמן. עשיתי בדיקה. תרשו לי לומר לכם, לקחתי שדות קרב שהוא הזכיר ברעיונות שלו. והתוצאה היא פשוטה, גם באופן יחסי, גם באופן מוחלט, ישראל פגעה בחפים מפשע ובכלל פגעה, פחות מאשר בכל עימות אחר. אמרתי לו, מר גולדסטון, אלה התוצאות, ואם הצבא האמריקאי הלך לקיצוניות כדי להגן על חיי אדם, המסקנה, לפי מה שאתה אומר, לא לפי מה שאני אומר, המסקנה היא שהצבא הישראלי הלך לקיצוניות של הקיצוניות של הקיצוניות כדי להגן על חיי אדם. אתה מוכן בבקשה לתת לי הסבר? הוא לא ענה לי. זו הייתה פעם ראשונה שהוא לא עונה לי, אבל לזכותו יאמר שהוא פרסם את המאמר שפה מן הסתם מוכר לרוב היושבים. אם הייתי יודע עכשיו, אז מה שאני יודע היום, דוח גולדסטון היה דוח שונה. תודה רבה לכם על ההקשבה.
תודה רבה. We have now another 20 minutes break, and then we come back for questions and answers and a discussion, a round table. 20 דקות. נוותר על הפסקה? אז 5 דקות, 5 minutes break, and we come back. No break? Okay, no break. All right, people don't want to have break. Okay, so please forward questions to me if you have. I'm going to collect questions.
Very interesting. What's that? Very interesting analysis. One of the main reasons of the success of BDS is the neglect, of an authority, of the authorities to meet, to react to an ongoing peace basis. What should Israel do and try to counterattack? Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Maybe I should answer that because I actually spoke to, so I suppose I can answer that. Well, here's the problem. I think I mentioned to you that it was very hard for me and Dana to even interest anyone in that particular issue, and everyone said here, Richard and others said here, that because there was no answer, it just went on and on and on. Now, when you lose in a battlefield, and this is a battlefield of sorts, not exactly, yeah, it is a battlefield, right? I really shouldn't say swords. Yeah, it is a battlefield. So you really start with a huge disadvantage here. And some of the things are very difficult to address right now. For instance, Horizon 2020, right? This was something that could have been addressed at the time that it was happening. It was not done behind closed doors and things. It was known that these things were happening. There was no one to address. Now, my personal opinion is that the government, and I'm talking about it in a very broad sense, is really not set up to deal with it. Who monitors the NGOs? Well, the short answer is that it is the NGO monitor, right? But this is only a small part of the NGOs? Who monitors the coalition of the NGOs? No one. The most important thing I have to say is no one understands where the money comes. And the thing about the New Israel Fund is like that proverbial drunk looking for his keys under a lamp. Why under a lamp? Because that's where the light is. So that's a problem. What needs to be done is a coordination at the highest levels of various ministries, and probably also the intelligence community. That's why it's not. This is what can be done to counteract the act. You see, sitting and complaining and I know fetching is. That's my response.
Go ahead, Ken. You want to say something?
Sure. Let me take the question in a slightly different way and focus on university campuses and also academic associations. I don't know what the questioner had in mind, but the question makes sense that way too, which is to say that one of the reasons that both the BDS movement and more generally anti-Israelism and anti-Semitism have recurred is that the authorities, meaning university administrators, have not taken effective action. And what we urge is for university presidents personally, directly, and explicitly to state not just reactively when bad things happen, but in advance that certain kinds of activity are hurtful and inconsistent with the university's mission and values, and to do it with respect to a wide variety of groups, anti-black, anti-woman, anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, whatever it is, so that when these things happen, they've laid the groundwork. For academic associations, recently a professor told me that when the Asian American Studies Association had a meeting, his university president sent around a memo saying, we will not reimburse expenses for professors who go to this meeting because of the way that the Asian American Studies Association voted on divestment. This is a little bit of unheard of, and I think the only reason he was able to get away with it is that he himself is not only Asian American, but also an Asian American Studies scholar and one of the most prominent Asian American university presidents. Of all of the university presidents who have made statements against the American Studies Association boycott, I'd like to see one of them say, we would not reimburse any expenses of professors who go there because we consider the actions of that association to be inconsistent with who we are as an institution.
Okay. Let me see if I can give a shot at that on two levels. One, a broader level that is more or less what Ophira is saying, which is we really need to think about this as a battlefield, the public sphere as a battlefield. We need to think about what the strengths of the enemy are, what the weaknesses of the enemy are, what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are, what their strategies, like this, what is it, Horizon 2020?
2020.
Right. So, I mean, this is something that Ophira has flagged as a looming problem, and we have to think about it, and we have to think about how to counter it. We have to think about BDS as a jihadi war strategy, which has managed to enlist both the radical left and a lot of progressives, including a lot of Jews, with a lot of false information. And there, I would say that the key to BDS is Israel Apartheid Week. That these weeks, these hate fests that occur on our campuses literally every spring, need to be systematically countered, and the lies upon which they're based, the lethal narratives upon which they're based, need to be challenged. And what better place than academia where evidence is supposed to count? So I think that we need to think about this strategically. We need to plan campaigns. We need to identify the major areas where the attacks are coming from, the major weaknesses of those attacks, and go after them. Well, you know, Ophira is talking about high levels of government. I've been trying to it took me 10 years to get the Israeli government to even acknowledge that Al-Dura was staged. So I don't have high hopes it seems to me we independent players, like everybody here, need to work that out. If you want a we, it's the Institute for Cognitive War Defense Research, which we're establishing. You've got to think this stuff through before you can go to public officials and say, oh, you should think this way. You can't say, hey, don't you understand? Wake up, wap, wap.
Okay, can I go to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. עד כמה מחרבייך ומשנאייך ממך יצאו, היינו מרצים שמאלניים קיצוניים בקמפוסים בישראל, או אקדמאים יהודים בגולה, שמצדיקים את החרם, מוסיפים שמן למדורת החרם האנטישמית של הגויים. בקיצור, מה תרומתנו שלנו, ישראלים ויהודים, לסיפור החרם? מותר לי לענות, נכון? גברתי המלכה. יש לכם תרגום למי ש... You have translation? Okay. Anyway, the answer is very simple. It became lately, זה נהיה באחרונה, סליחה שאני... בשנים האחרונות, זה לא תוספת, זה המקור העיקרי. אני עוקב אחרי הדברים האלה. המקור העיקרי היום לתעשיית השקרים ולשקרים, זה מדינת ישראל, זה מרצים מישראל, וזה מרצים יהודים בארצות הברית. זה המקור העיקרי. וזה המקור הבטוח ביותר והטוב ביותר. כי זה ישראלים ויהודים. אז קשה מאוד לבוא ולומר אנטישמיות. אבל כמעט כל שקר שמתפרסם היום בעולם על ידי ה-BDS, על ידי קמפיין האפרטהייד, הוא שקר שמקורו או בעיתון ישראלי, ואני הייתי יכול לשבת לכם עם מצגת פה במשך כמה שעות ולהציג לכם את השקרים שהמקור שלהם הוא ישראל. זה אנחנו. ישראל, יש בה חופש ביטוי. הדרך היחידה להתמודד עם זה, זה פשוט להפריך את השקרים ולהראות שמדובר בשקרים. אני לא מכיר דרך אחרת, אני לא רוצה, אני כאדם, כאזרח, כעיתונאי, לא רוצה לסתום את הפה לאף אחד. יש מאמר מאוד מעניין של פרופסור אמנון רובינשטיין בסוגיית חופש הביטוי האקדמי. אני לא רוצה להיכנס לפרטים, אבל יש תשובות בלי לפגוע בחופש הביטוי בכלל ובחופש הביטוי האקדמי בפרט.
Just to emphasize the point that Ben Drol made, I've been speaking with somebody who was working for CNN at the time that the Aldura story hit. And when the chief editor saw the footage, he didn't want to run the story. He thought that the footage was suspicious, and he wasn't going to run the story. And then Charles Ondelin, formerly of Dovel Tzahal, ran the story. And then the next day, the Jews in the office were saying to the Gentile chief editor, "You've got to run this story."
So let me respond to this first. And in fact, I think the two most recent questions are related. As I understand them, what can Israel and Jews do about this bonfire of anti-Semitism, and what specifically can be done about administrators to get them to respond to BDS? I recommend a three-pronged strategy for dealing with this anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. I think the first and most important thing to do is to stay on our own message and our own turf. The first thing that has to be done in defending Israel is to create positive images of Israel, not relating to the conflict necessarily, but make sure that Israel is presenting images of what it does strongly, whether it has to do with democracy or technology or however Israel and the Jewish community define the strength. Stay with strength first. Second, respond to the myths and defamations. That's reactive, but you have to do it, and there are various ways to do it. Third, it seems to me that beyond sending a positive message and reacting, you also have to fight anti-Semitism. A lot of people within the Jewish community would prefer to avoid that subject for some of the reasons I mentioned. And my feeling is that while this isn't necessarily the first approach to anti-Israelism, if you don't do it, you're never going to solve the problem. Now, how do you respond to that, and how do you respond to the administrators? I think that the Jewish community and Israel need to have both insider strategies and outsider strategies. if we're talking about a university president who has a million different things to do and dealing with discrimination is one of many, and within the discrimination issue, the Jews are one of many. You need to have inside strategies, developing relationships with the university leaders on a continual basis so that when bad things happen, you have those ties. And it's important for groups to find different ways of opening up communications. But that's not enough. There are lots of groups that have gotten so accustomed to developing insider strategies that they're reluctant to speak out against problems when they happen. So there have to be also individuals and groups who take outsider strategies. That can't be the only way we do it. You have to have some inside, having lunch with the president, so on and so forth. But you also have to have people who are willing to speak out on a range of different methods and procedures, going from making a stink, protesting, letter-writing campaigns, to the litigation strategy. So at the Louis D. Brandeis Center, there are institutions where we have close relationships with senior leadership, but we also have to be ready when the time comes either to make public statements or, if need be, to litigate. And I think that it is useful to have within the community people who take both kinds of strategy.
עוד שאלה אחת בעברית, שאלה חשובה. איזו ביקורת מתאימה מבלי שתחשב לאנטישמיות? ושאלה בעצם, שאלת משנה, האם התנחלויות הן פשע מלחמה? אוקיי, אני אנסה לענות. א', יש הרבה מאוד ביקורת על ישראל שהיא רחוקה מאוד מכל אנטישמיות. אני חושב שיש ויכוח נוקב וסוער בתוך מדינת ישראל לגבי הדרך הנכונה, לגבי מה ישראל צריכה לעשות בנושא השלום, לגבי, ונדמה ששיא הוויכוח בישראל, שיא הוויכוח, הוא בשאלת ההתנחלויות. עכשיו, אני אומר את זה מזווית מאוד אישית, אבל פוליטית, מכיוון שהעמדה שלי לגבי ההתנחלויות היא, אני אומר את הדברים בלשון המעטה כדי שלא יזרקו עליי כאן עגבניות, מכיוון שהעמדה שלי לגבי ההתנחלויות היא מאוד ביקורתית, ואני אומר את זה באמת בלשון המעטה, אני לא חושב שאני אנטישמי. יש לי עמדה פוליטית מסוימת. אני רק חושב, העמדה שלי לגבי ההתנחלויות לא מונעת ממני לעסוק הרבה מאוד בתעשיית השקרים נגד מדינת ישראל. כלומר, אפשר להיות מאוד ביקורתי כלפי המדיניות הישראלית, בלי להיכנס לשקרים, בלי להיכנס למלכודות האנטישמיות. לצערי, חלק מהשמאל שהיה פעם לגיטימי, חצה את כל הקווים האדומים, ונמצא היום במקום אחר, אבל זה סיפור להרצאה אחרת.
One second. On the subject of settlements, I'd like to say this. I don't take a position on the settlements, but I do take a position on the role of the settlements in the conflict. And I think that it's a magnificent jihadi cognitive war victory to convince people like John Kerry that the settlements are the key to the problem, and if it weren't for the settlements, the problem could be solved. It's a complete misunderstanding of what the fight is about. It's based, like all other lethal narratives, on Palestinian testimony. The Palestinians are saying to us, the settlements is what's the problem. And instead of saying, why do you say that? We go, oh my gosh, let's force the Israelis to back off of the settlements and then we'll solve the problem. It's got to be one of the stupidest pieces of policy that's ever been put together. And I think one of the driving forces, to get back to what Ben Drol was saying about Jewish sources, I have friends who feel that the settlements are, it's kibush hamashchit, it's this corrupting occupation, and it must be stopped at all costs. And if telling lies about Israel, and I think this is J Street's policy, if telling lies about Israel, if telling every lethal narrative about how awful the occupation is, will help end the settlements, then it's worth it.
Here, there's a number of questions here. The first one is for you, Ken. I'll try to explain that. Translated, it says that that before the Oslo Agreement, Israel has denied that the Palestinians have an identity and any sovereign rights, and that the United States has actually supported that. In other words, Israel and the United States have delegitimized the Palestinians both in theory and in practice.
Just to make it more accurate, the right to self-determination state of their own.
Yeah, the state of their own, and so that would be your what would be your
What's the
yeah.
question? Explain my question.
Sure.
Just to universalize European historical criteria for anti-Semitism, Israel hasn't been through any practice of discrimination with the Palestinian rights of discrimination. You call that a kind of anti-Semitism / racism against the Palestinians. They don't have to work for it.
I don't know. I would consider that can you hear me? So I understand the question to be something like the following. Prior to the Oslo Agreement, Israel and the United States denied the legitimacy of a Palestinian state. Would you consider that to be, and I think the gist of the question is, would you consider that to be an example of anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab or anti-Muslim discrimination by universalizing this notion of delegitimacy? And I think that that's an interesting question. I do not think that the 3 Ds of Natan Sharansky's test were intended to be universalized or could be, right? So I do not think that it makes sense to apply those 3 Ds to every ethnic group around the world. I don't think it necessarily makes sense for Chechens or Basques or things of that sort. I think that it has to do with the distinctive history of the Jewish people. I think that Sharansky was saying that if you look at the patterns of anti-Semitic stereotypes and defamations over history, there are certain patterns. And if you see certain kinds of recurrence of that pattern with a focus on Israel, there's at least, I would say, a presumption that it's a continuation of that. And because he was understanding the relationship between anti-Israel hostility and anti-Jewish prejudice in the context of the history of a particular people, I would say that it's probably best not just to take that approach off the shelf, as it were, and to say that's the universal method for understanding all forms of discrimination against all other peoples. I think that the better way to understand what is anti-Palestinian discrimination, what is anti-whatever, any other kind of animus, would be to follow a similar approach, which is to say, look at what are the patterns, if any, of discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes that other group has faced, if you're talking about African Americans or Chinese or whatever, and then ask whether it's recurring today. So I hope I'm not dodging the question, but what I would say is don't universalize the approach you're using to any one particular group. Instead, if you want to find a method for identifying anti-Palestinian prejudice, start with the history of that people and then go forward.
Sorry, there is one for you here, so we need really to wrap it up, so I'll just, there's one for you, and it says, why do you think that the BDS is a expression of jihadism, where in fact it's a secular phenomenon? And the one for Dror Ben-Dror Yamini is, if transfer was such a legitimate, and well, not legitimate, but at least a widespread phenomenon and quite acceptable at the time, why do you think that Ben-Gurion had to go into all sorts of conniptions to make sure that it doesn't look like a transfer? Why he didn't just come out with it? And then, of course, there was a criticism of Martin Buber and others about it. So maybe you should then, in 2 minutes for all of us.
Okay, so the question of why I think that it's a jihadi cognitive war strategy, it appears part of the jihadi war cognitive war strategy is not to say, yes, this is how we take over the world, it's to enlist Westerners to join. So it's phrased in secular terms, just like Palestinian nationalism was framed in secular terms, but as Benny Morris discovered when he wrote his book on 1948, it was a jihad. There's been a jihad against Israel, and by and large, most Israelis and most Westerners have not wanted to see that. In fact, Benny Morris's book was rejected by 2 editors before he finally found a publisher at Yale University Press, precisely because he called it a jihad. So part of the problem here is the jihadi strategy is to get the West to abandon Israel to Islamic hatred. And the idea that by getting Israel to by getting the West to abandon Israel to jihadi hatred is going to solve the problem along the lines of the Jews are the problem. If only we get rid of them or we get rid of their state, then the problems will be solved, is insane. It's a complete misreading of the situation. So I'm not saying that the people who are involved in BDS think that they're fulfilling jihadi cognitive war strategies, but that's what they're doing.
Okay, השאלה...
Oh, and one last thing. The driver behind BDS is Muslim Students Organization, is Students for Justice in Palestine. These are all jihadi groups. If you go back and look at what Bazian was saying, he was already quoting the genocidal hadith about the rocks and the trees back in the 1990s when he was a graduate student at Berkeley.
אוקיי, השאלה שאני נשאלתי, אם טרנספר היה עניין מקובל, למה בן גוריון עשה כל כך הרבה מאמצים להסתיר אותו? אז א', בן גוריון לא עשה מאמצים להסתיר אותו, כי בן גוריון אף פעם לא תכנן טרנספר. תוכנית ד' הידועה, שכביכול היא הבסיס לאותו טרנספר, הייתה תוכנית מקצועית. מה שקרה שם קרה בהרבה מאוד מלחמות, לא היה תכנון ולא היה זדון, והיה דיון בשאלה הזאת לאורך כל עשרות השנים שלפני 48, כאשר באופן מאוד מעניין, התמיכה בטרנספר בקרב היישוב היהודי, וזה כולל את ז'בוטינסקי, הייתה קטנה יותר מאשר בארצות אחרות. וגם כאשר הלייבור הבריטי כתב במצע שלו, לאחר דיון, שהוא תומך בטרנספר, נשמעה התנגדות מצד התנועה הציונית משני הצדדים, גם על ידי הרוויזיוניסטים. אז כדאי לשים את הדברים בסדר הנכון שלהם. אני, תאמין לי שקראתי גם את בני מוריס וקראתי גם אחרים, גם אצל בני מוריס שכתב על הטרנספר אף פעם, אבל אף פעם לא כתב שתוכנית ד' הייתה איזושהי מזימת גירוש, בכוונה של מזימת גירוש. אף פעם זה לא... בן גוריון לא הסתיר, שוב, זאת אומרת כאילו אתה עושה קצת שכתוב היסטוריה. עכשיו, את יודע מה? אני אלך איתך צעד קדימה, ונגיד שבן גוריון הסתיר, so what? זאת הייתה הנורמה באותן שנים. זאת הייתה הנורמה באותן שנים. אז נגיד אגב, הוא לא הסתיר, אבל זאת הייתה הנורמה פחות אצל ראשי היישוב היהודי מאשר אצל כל האחרים, כאשר ועידת פוצדם ב-45 מחליטה על גירוש כל הגרמנים, כאשר יש חילופי אוכלוסייה בין פולין לאוקראינה, כאשר מאות אלפים מגורשים בהונגריה ובבולגריה ובמקומות אחרים. לא, בוודאי, 14 מיליון, זאת אומרת, כאילו, עכשיו, זו הייתה הנורמה, גם לא הצגתי לכם את כל החומרים שלי, גם בית המשפט העליון שקדם לבית המשפט, עכשיו, אני רוצה להגיד, אני חייב להגיד, אבל אני עכשיו חייב, אני חייב לומר משהו, שאלה שבהקשר הזה, תודה, שאלה בהקשר הזה שעלתה כאן, שאלה שעלתה כאן שוב ושוב, ואני שומע אותה לאחר ההרצאות שאני נותן בקמפוסים בארצות הברית, שאלה שחוזרת על עצמה כל הזמן, והשאלה אומרת כך, אוקיי, הצגת לנו את הנתונים, וישראל באמת, נגיד שאתה צודק, ואז מגיע הסכין, but we hold you for higher standards. עכשיו רגע, אני אגיד לכם מה התשובה שלי. אבל אנחנו חושבים שאתם צריכים להתנהג לפי סטנדרטים גבוהים יותר. We hold you for...
Okay,
No, I have to finish. אני רוצה להגיד לכם מה התשובה שלי, כי היא מאוד פשוטה. לאותו סטודנט שאומר לי, בפעם הראשונה שנשאלתי, ישבה לידו בחורה עם וייל, עם כיסוי ראש, עם חיג'אב. ואז אמרתי לו, תשמע, ג'ון, when you tell me that you hold me for higher standards, I have just one thing to ask you. Please ask Fatma, that is sitting next to you, if she accepts that you hold her for lower standards.
Okay, on this cheerful note, we would end. Thank you so much for coming and being patient. Thank you.
יש כאן מישהו שנוסע לתל אביב? לא, איפה שלא יהיה, תל אביב העיקר.